Okay, Ceramics 1, so we're going to be diving into hand building techniques. We're going to bypass the pinch pots because they're the most basic. They have a tendency to look a little bit elementary, and I'm going to show you a couple other techniques that'll allow you to do a form of pinch pots that'll be a little bit more sophisticated later on. We're going to go into coil pots. I think you'll find that this is a good place to start for us. And then we're going to segue into slab building, which is going to be our friend for the majority of Ceramics 1 as well as Ceramics 2 and beyond. So hand building is basically where you are constructing without use of the pottery wheel and you're not doing slip casting. Slab, you are able to use the slab roller. It's basically where you are going to be constructing by use of the majority of the time using your hands to construct. Throwing on the pottery wheel, yes, you're using your hands, but you're using this, major mechanical component to help you construct. So it's not technically considered a hand building technique because you're really relying on the pottery wheel to do the construction rather than, your hands to do, the majority of the building technique itself. So you're really leaning on the pottery wheel as a crutch. Whereas with coiling, you are having to do a specific, really refined building skill in order to do this construction that requires a lot of like labor intensive building. Okay. So this word aesthetics, we've heard this a lot lately on social media with people that are like, oh my gosh, it's so aesthetic. But this word, as far as, in that term goes, has kind of been taken out of context a little bit. So aesthetics is the philosophy of all things beautiful. Your aesthetic is different than my aesthetic. So just saying like, oh my gosh, it's so aesthetic, like that doesn't really make sense because I think they're trying to say that it has an aesthetically pleasing feel to that person, but they're like shortcutting that phrase, if that makes sense. So they're saying basically they find it attractive and beautiful, but it's kind of like compressing that phrase down. So my aesthetic is different than yours, meaning maybe like I am really attracted to the chevron print, but you hate it, or you like polka dots and I don't. Or maybe I find this work of art aesthetically pleasing and you really dislike something strong about it. Maybe it's the colors or the arrangement of the objects. There's something about it that doesn't rest well in your eyes and you don't find it aesthetically pleasing. Whereas I maybe look at this and I do like the color arrangement. It does sit well with my eyes. So your aesthetic is really important because that is going to come into play with every single thing we do. I wanted to point out the elements and principles of design just because in 3D classes, they look quite different. So line looks different in a 3D class instead of a 2D class. So these are some examples of what the element of line can look like in ceramics class. So you could use it either with construction in the coils, like the upper left-hand piece, or it could be done with line work with regards to glazing, like the bottom piece. Shapes. These are geometric shapes. This is very difficult to achieve with clay because clay is not a geometric material. It's very organic, like these pieces here. It's not, real predictable. It's got a very, earthy element about it. It likes to shift. It likes to bend. That doesn't lend itself really well if we go back to this geometric slide. It doesn't mean that it's impossible. It just means that these geometric shapes are going to have to take time with your skill and refinement before you're going to be able to achieve these sorts of things. So don't get frustrated with yourself if your coil pot looks a lot more organic and earthy and maybe lumpy like the one on the right there, or it maybe even looks more lumpy, and that's okay. Color. That's going to come into play when we start talking about glazing, and glazing is really essential with pottery. It's going to help seal in your clay surface and make it dinnerware safe officially. But it's also important to note that you want to take time to refine your surfaces because if your surfaces are cracked and they're lumpy and you put glaze on it, well, number one, you're using a really expensive material. Glazes are about $20 a pint roughly. and you're putting it over top of a cracked surface, so it's already a broken surface. It's not going to get any better. It's not going to really necessarily improve it. It's really just coloring something that's already, going to probably break eventually. So you want to take time to refine it on the front end before it's bisque fired. And that way, when you add color, it's going to showcase everything rather than drawing attention to all the imperfections. Texture is so important with clay. This is so essential because if you're making things that are dinnerware safe and functional, a texture such as the upper right hand image would be absolutely horrifying on the interior of a bowl that you were going to eat out of versus maybe something a little more sculptural or a vase. You could get away with that. But if it's going to be something you're going to eat or drink out of, you would not ever use the texture on the bottom right there. So you really want to think about a texture that makes sense with the overall design of the piece. It's going to be aesthetically pleasing, but it's also going to be functional and make sense. So texture is really key. Here's some more examples. The upper right, prime example here. You would never in a million years use that on a platter that you're going to serve food off of. If you think about, just eating like a chili out of a bowl that had that texture on the inside, that would be horrifying because bacteria would build up in those crevices. Ugh. But on a sculpture, it works. Now, form for us, everything we build is going to be a form. It has height, it has width, and it has depth. In our sketches, we are going to be trying to capture the illusion of depth. So being able to add value is going to be key in our planning to try to show the illusion of depth. You could do that through use of value. You could try to achieve value through use of color as well. So value doesn't necessarily have to be black and white. It can also be a color scale. Space is really goes hand in hand with 3D objects. If you think about a coffee mug, the space between the handle and the mug itself, that little air pocket is going to be the negative space. The area inside of the coffee mug where the coffee goes is negative space until you fill it with coffee. So the positive in 3D art is the actual object, and the negative is the air that kind of dances around inside of it. With our clay, wedging is going to be essential, especially when we get to throwing on the pottery wheel. This is the removal of air bubbles. So when we mix our clay, that's the kneading. So kneading is the mixing. Wedging, you do the exact same motion, but that's when everything is kind of mixed all together, and then it segues into the time where the clay actually starts compressing out the air bubbles. That is so important with regards to throwing because air bubbles will throw you off. When it comes to firing, air bubbles can create tension pockets and pressure pockets, but research is finding more and more that actually the main culprit with explosions in the kiln is moisture. If you have moisture and air bubbles, that is certain death for your piece. So one thing you can do is to wedge your clay to reduce those air pockets, reduce that pressure during firing. That way, if you do have a little bit of moisture, you're far less likely to experience blow-ups and, explosions and things like that. But I will do my best to fire your pieces when it appears that the majority of the moisture has fired out. Here's some examples of pinch pots. You can actually use these to make hollow forms. So this is an example of making rattles or a clay figure, for example. So it's just basically where you ball up the clay and then you jam your little thumb in there and you start kind of like, pinching between your thumb and your forefinger to reduce the thickness of the size of the clay. They're a labor of love. They're really challenging to make even consistent coils. So I'm going to show you a trick to get nice consistent coils that I think you'll find really friendly. I am going to let you cheat and add a little slab cookie kind of cutter bottom, a little circle. It doesn't have to be a circle though. It could be an oval, could be a heart, whatever works with your design. And then I'm going to show you how you can roll with the palm of your hand to get a nice even coil. You are able to incorporate some fancy schmancy coils, get some designs, some patterns, spirals, maybe add some little balls of clay in there to add a little bit of extra interest to your coil pot. You could also perhaps add a sculptural element to it. I want you to think about whether or not you want your coil pot to be functional, like the pieces in the upper right-hand corner. The inside of the coils have been smoothed Perhaps you could add a little extra slip in there to make sure that there's no cracks or leaks. If you would like it to be a planter, that's going to be pretty important. If you want it to be a bowl that you're going to eat or drink out of, that's also important. You don't want to have leaks coming out of there. So sealing the inside is going to be really important. It's also going to help your coils stay together because they like to shrink apart as it dries. Then we're going to move on into slab. I think you're going to really like slab. You can make really large scale pieces pretty efficiently and quickly. It helps you make large flat pancake pieces of clay very quickly and nice and uniform, where you don't have to worry about one end being taller than the other. You can use that slab to make drape molds or press molds. You can use a cookie cutter, you can use a template, a stencil to cut it, and then this right here is a drape mold. You would actually drape the clay on the outside of it. Clay does shrink as it dries, so you have to watch that it's not going to constrict and crack around the form. Notice that they've used saran wrap. That's going to help release the clay. This is an example of a press pot. So this is where you're actually going to press the clay into the pot or into the template. This artist has used newsprint to help release. I prefer the plastic because it gets less wrinkles and crinkles, but you know, it could be kind of cool to have that texture. It just doesn't matter, just you have to have something in between the Tupperware and your clay in order to release it. Once it's been bisque fired, then we can apply glaze. And it's important to take note of this image. This glaze actually looks really powdered. It doesn't look shiny. That's because glazes are not like paints. Paints have pigments. That's naturally occurring, you know, elements in nature. And what you see is pretty much what you get with paint. If I'm using a blue acrylic, when it dries, it pretty much looks like it did when I applied it. This glaze right here appears red because it has a high iron content. You could fire this up and it actually is a green glaze. It's because of the iron that's in it. Once we fire this piece to its maturation point, which is where it's going to actually reach its maturing point, it's going to melt, then it's going to cool. You have a super cooled liquid that reveals a glass-like coating, and then it's going to be shiny. So this piece is going to look dramatically different. Don't trust what it looks like in the bottle. You want to look up the sample online, and I'm going to give you a reference for that here in a little bit. These are what the glazes are going to look like after they're fired. So they look dramatically different. So these are some student examples of the drape molds and press pots after they've actually gone through the second firing, the glaze firing. If it's going to blow up and crack and break, it's going to do it in that first firing. But I do the best job I can of making sure the moisture has evaporated out of your pieces. And I do a very, very slow firing to try to reduce the chances of cracks and breaks. And that way you can, you know, rest assured that we've done everything we could to make sure you're going to get to take your piece home that you've worked so hard on. Then we have feet and footings. This is a really cool way to elevate your piece and kind of take it to the next level. It just kind of takes it off of the table and doesn't make it look so kind of frumpy and heavy, but it doesn't always make sense with the piece. It kind of depends on your design. Just kind of throwing this out there for you just so you can be thinking about it. A simple coil on the bottom works, or it could be, you know, little coil legs, or some people get funny and they put literally feet on the bottom. It just kind of depends on, you know, your plan and what you have in mind. Different types of kilns. We don't have a wood kiln. This has to be outside. A lot of colleges will have wood kilns in their ceramics programs. These are really awesome because you can fit hundreds of pots in there, and you load the kiln, you stack it. And the interesting thing about the way this process goes, you have to stoke that fire. It's kind of like a wood stove, and you got to keep that temperature nice and hot. So sometimes potters will work together and it'll be like a co-op experience, and they'll take turns because you've got to keep that fire nice and hot over that 24-hour period. So sometimes it'll even be a camp out experience to kind of keep it going, because if you don't reach peak temperature and the kiln starts to cool, you've got to start all over again. So not only do you have kilns, you have different types of firings. So you can do what's called stagger firings and salt firings, and then you can do ash firings. There's all sorts of different things you can do that give you different results within this particular kiln. Quite different than electric kilns like the one on the right that we have. That's what schools tend to have, elementary, junior high, and high schools, because it's really safe, it's predictable, it's got what's called a kiln sitter, which is the computer box on the outside. That is going to allow me to program it, hit start, go home, and rest assured at night that I'm not going to burn the school down, versus the wood kiln that you saw and the gas kiln here on the left. Notice how many pieces you can fire in that bad boy. Bummer about the gas kiln though is you've got to kind of like manually turn it up. You got to watch it. And it's a very long firing process, and somebody's got to be there to babysit it, or you can really, really mess that up. So that's why a lot of, elementary, middle, and high schools are going to have that electric kiln, because it's really quite safer. And most kilns aren't wired for gas. They're going to have that electric though. So what the heck are we doing? We're going to make what I call crazy pots. And this is going to be a combination of hand building methods. Like I said, you can start with a little slab base. We're going to be doing coiling most of the piece. We're going to shoot for something that's like no taller than 6 inches tall. I think you can get the point of the coil pot within that. Don't go any smaller than 4 inches though, because remember, it's going to shrink as it dries, and then it shrinks again as it's fired. So if you only make this 4 inches tall, after it's fired, it's probably only going to be about 3.5 inches tall, which is pretty small. I want you to explore a wide range of like patterns and get funky with the design. Maybe add some sort of sculptural element like Mr. Lizard there in the upper right. You might want to take a glance at what's called Jamenware, this piece on the bottom right here. This is a really cool form of ancient pottery that they make extremely ornate coils, and there's some really great inspiration to be drawn from there. So I want you to check out my Pinterest board that's got some great references for not only coil pots, but Jamenware. Then you can collect your 8 to 10 images for reference. It could also be tutorials like how to build. These are your inspiration. From that inspiration, I want you to create some sketches that have value and color, and really be thinking about what I want to make. Form versus function here, that refers to like function. Does it have a use or a purpose? Form would be, it's maybe just art for art's sake. It's sculptural. It doesn't necessarily have a function or purpose. This is the only project this semester where you can really get away with having something that's maybe more sculptural. So kind of keep that in mind. You don't have to have a function for this. It could be purely sculptural, okay? Here's some great sketch examples. This kiddo did some amazing sketches. She's got the overall shape or form of the coil pot itself. Her far right example here, totally purely sculptural. It's a funky, weird, almost like a, oh, the places you'll go, like Whoville kind of sculpture. The other two were functional vases, but quite ornate. She ended up taking out a lot of those coils and simplifying it for her actual sculpture. But for her plans, they were beautiful. And she just, instead of doing like real detail, like coloring, she did more of like an airbrush kind of thing to save herself some time. But these are gorgeous because I can really tell what she wanted to make, and I can see a defined, color scheme and color palette coming through. Here's some other great sketches here. So we've got the upper right hand one. I can really see her color palette. I can really see, what she wants to do here. It's going to be functional, but it's also got a sculptural element to it. So these are all great sketches. These would show me what you want to do. The one in the bottom middle, that person actually had the pottery app and pretend like threw a little piece of pottery, screenshotted it, and then like drew over it in the sketchbook app and used that as part of their plan. So that was a really cool thing to do. So keep that in mind. You can, sketch over bits and pieces of things that you found from Pinterest that you really like and use it for inspiration. We don't want to copy it. We want to try and find a way to make it your own. So here's just a repeat of that slide before that I showed you for the requirements and what we're going to be doing. So basically today, you get to watch this video that I just made for you, and then go out on your own to the Pinterest board, start collecting your inspiration, and do your sketches. And these are going to be due before our next class so that we can hopefully dive into this after we finish up our current project. And just email me with any questions.